Chapter 17 of The Mystery of Edwin Drood. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Alan Chant. The Mystery of Edwin Drood, the unfinished novel by Charles Dickens. Chapter 17. Philanthropy, Professional and Unprofessional. Full half a year had come and gone, and Mr. Crisparkle sat in a waiting-room in the London chief offices of the Haven of Philanthropy, until he could have audience of Mr. Honeythunder. In his college days of athletic exercises, Mr. Crisparkle had known professors of the noble art of fisticuffs, and had attended 2 or 3 of their gloved gatherings. He had now an opportunity of observing that, as to the phrenological formation of the backs of their heads, the professing philanthropists were uncommonly like the pugilists. In the development of all those organs which constitute or attend a propensity to pitch into your fellow creatures, the philanthropists were remarkably favoured. There were several professors passing in and out, with exactly the aggressive air upon them of being ready for a turn-up with any novice who might happen to be on hand, that Mr. Crisparkle well remembered in the circles of the fancy. Preparations were in progress for a moral little mill somewhere on the rural circuit, and other professors were backing this or that heavyweight as good for such or such speak-making hits, so very much after the manner of the sporting publicans, that the intended resolutions might have been rounds. In an official manager of these displays, much celebrated for his platform tactics, Mr. Crisparkle recognised, in a suit of black, the counterpart of a deceased benefactor of his species, an eminent public character, once known to fame as Frosty-Faced Fogo, who in days of yore superintended the formation of the magic circle with the ropes and stakes. There were only 3 conditions of resemblance wanting between these professors and those. Firstly, the philanthropists were in very bad training, much too fleshy, and presenting both in face and figure a superabundance of what is known to pugilistic experts as suet pudding. Secondly, the philanthropists had not the good temper of the pugilists, and used worse language. Thirdly, their fighting code stood in great need of revision, as empowering them not only to bore their man to the ropes, but to bore him to the confines of distraction, also to hit him when he was down, hit him anywhere and anyhow, kick him, stamp upon him, gouge him, and maul him behind his back, without mercy. In these last particulars, the professors of the noble art were much nobler than the professors of philanthropy. Mr. Crisparkle was so completely lost in musing on these similarities and dissimilarities, at the same time watching the crowd which came and went by, always as it seemed on errands of antagonistically snatching something from somebody, and never giving anything to anybody, that his name was called before he heard it. On his at length responding, he was shown by a miserably shabby and underpaid stipendiary philanthropist, who could hardly have done worse if he had taken service with a declared enemy of the human race, to Mr. Honeythunder's room. "Sir," said Mr. Honeythunder, in his tremendous voice, like a schoolmaster issuing orders to a boy of whom he had a bad opinion, "sit down." Mr. Crisparkle seated himself. Mr. Honeythunder, having signed the remaining few score of a few thousand circulars, calling upon corresponding numbers of families without means to come forward, stump up instantly, and be philanthropists, or go to the devil, another shabby stipendiary philanthropist, highly disinterested, if in earnest, gathered these into a basket, and walked off with them.
"Now, Mr. Crisparkle,"
said Mr. Honeythunder, turning his chair half round towards him when they were alone, and squaring his arms with his hands on his knees and his brows knitted, as if he added,
"I am going to make short work of you. Now, Mr. Crisparkle, we entertain different views, you and I, sir, of the sanctity of human life."
"Do we?" returned the Minor Canon.
"We do, sir."
"Might I ask you," said the Minor Canon, "what are your views on that subject?"
"That human life is a thing to be held sacred, sir."
"Might I ask you," pursued the Minor Canon as before, "what you suppose to be my views on that subject?"
"By George, sir,"
returned the Philanthropist, squaring his arms still more, as he frowned on Mr. Crisparkle,
"they are best known to yourself."
"Readily admitted. But you began by saying that we took different views, you know. Therefore, or you could not say so, you must have set up some views as mine. Pray, what views have you set up as mine?"
"Here is a man, and a young man,"
said Mr. Honeythunder, as if that made the matter infinitely worse, and he could have easily borne the loss of an old one,
"swept off the face of the earth by a deed of violence. What do you call that?"
"Murder," said the Minor Canon.
"And what do you call the doer of that deed, sir?"
"A murderer," said the Minor Canon.
"I am glad to hear you admit so, sir,"
retorted Mr. Honeythunder in his most offensive manner,
"and I candidly tell you that I didn't expect it."
Here he lowered heavily at Mr. Crisparkle again. "Be so good as to explain what you mean by those very unjustifiable expressions."
"I don't sit here, sir,"
returned the Philanthropist, raising his voice to a roar,
"to be browbeaten."
"As the only other person present, no one can possibly know that better than I do," returned the Minor Canon very quietly. "But I interrupt your explanation."
"Murder?"
proceeded Mr. Honeythunder, in a kind of boisterous reverie, with his platform folding of his arms, and his platform nod of abhorrent reflection after each short sentiment of a word.
"Bloodshed? Abel? Cain? I hold no terms with Cain. I repudiate with a shudder the red hand when it is offered me."
Instead of instantly leaping into his chair and cheering himself hoarse, as the brotherhood in public meeting assembled would infallibly have done on this cue, Mr. Crisparkle merely reversed the quiet crossing of his legs, and said mildly, "Don't let me interrupt your explanation when you begin it."
"The commandments say, no murder. No murder, sir,"
proceeded Mr. Honeythunder, platformally pausing, as if he took Mr. Crisparkle to task for having distinctly asserted that they said, "You may do a little murder, and then leave off." "And they also say you shall bear no false witness," observed Mr. Crisparkle.
"Enough!"
bellowed Mr. Honeythunder, with a solemnity and severity that would have brought the house down at a meeting.
"Enough! My late wards being now of age, and I being released from a trust which I cannot contemplate without a thrill of horror, there are the accounts which you have undertaken to accept on their behalf, and there is a statement of the balance which you have undertaken to receive, and which you cannot receive too soon. And let me tell you, sir, I wish that as a man and a Minor Canon you were better